It is the morning of the 11th of July, 1944, somewhere south of Caen, in the fields around the shattered village of Maltot. The air smells of cordite and wet earth, and a fine drizzle drifts sideways across the hedgerows that the soldiers here have already learned to fear more than any open ground. Engines growl low across the bocage, the thick tangled hedges and sunken lanes that have turned this quiet corner of Normandy into a maze of ambush and slaughter. A column of tanks moves forward at walking pace, their tracks churning the mud, their crews sealed inside steel hulls thick enough to shrug off anti-tank rounds that would tear through anything else the British Army possesses. Behind one of them trundles something unfamiliar, something that does not belong to the ordinary vocabulary of armored warfare. A squat, riveted trailer, painted in drab olive, following on its own wheels like some obedient, monstrous pet. Inside it, sealed under pressure, sit 400 gallons of thickened fuel and cylinders of compressed nitrogen gas. German infantry, dug into a farmhouse and a line of slit trenches, watch the tanks approach and prepare to do what they have done to a dozen other British attacks this summer: hold their nerve, let the armor close, and answer with a Panzerfaust or an 88. Then the lead tank halts. A nozzle, mounted where a machine gun should be, tilts towards the farmhouse. There is a metallic hiss, a spark, and the field in front of the German position disappears inside a roaring orange wall of flame that reaches out across more than 100 meters in under 2 seconds. Men who have survived Allied naval bombardment, rocket-firing aircraft, and concentrated artillery abandon their weapons and run, or raise their hands, because there is no training, no doctrine, and no courage that prepares a soldier for being burned alive inside his own trench. Records suggest that in more than one engagement that summer, the mere sight of this machine rolling into view was enough to end a fight before a shot from its main gun was ever needed. Few of the men watching it that wet July morning could have guessed that this ungainly trailer-towing tank would become one of the most feared weapons fielded by any army in the Second World War, or that its story had begun not with fire, but with failure. For more incredible true stories from World War II, carefully researched and brought to life, subscribe to the channel and never miss a new documentary. To understand why Britain built a tank that breathed flame, it is necessary to go back 2 years to the disastrous raid on Dieppe in August 1942. There, Canadian and British troops were cut to pieces attempting to storm a heavily defended French port directly from the sea, and the losses were catastrophic, with well over 3,000 of the 6,000 men who landed killed, wounded, or captured in a single day. Among the many lessons drawn from that failure was a simple and brutal one. Conventional tanks, however heavily armored, could not deal with concrete bunkers, minefields, anti-tank obstacles, and dug-in defenders without suffering horrendous casualties in the attempt. A Churchill tank fitted with an experimental flame projector, known as the Churchill OK, had actually been tested during the Dieppe raid itself, though mechanical failures meant it never properly proved its worth in action. Still, the idea would not die. Planners looking ahead to the eventual invasion of occupied Europe knew they would face the Atlantic Wall, a chain of fortifications, pillboxes, gun emplacements, and beach obstacles that Germany had spent years constructing along the coastline of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Aerial photographs and intelligence reports built up a grim picture of concrete strongpoints capable of withstanding direct hits from tank guns and naval shells alike, manned by defenders who could simply wait out a bombardment and then re-emerge to man their machine guns the moment infantry came within range. Existing British and American tanks, whatever their gun caliber, struggled to destroy such positions quickly, and infantry sent forward to finish the job with grenades and rifles paid for every yard in blood. The specification eventually drawn up by the Petroleum Warfare Department called for a flamethrower capable of at least a minute of continuous fire, with a range of some 80 yards. Its fuel held in a jettisonable trailer, so that the tank itself would not become a rolling bomb if the fuel were struck by enemy fire. Early trials in 1942 were shelved when the War Office judged that tanks were too vulnerable at close range for flame warfare, and that smaller, man-carried or carrier-mounted flame weapons such as the Wasp were the safer answer. Yet the problem those planners kept returning to was scale. A soldier crawling forward with a man-pack flamethrower had perhaps 10 seconds of fuel and almost no protection. Against the Atlantic Wall, something far larger, far better protected, and far more sustained would be needed, and only a heavily armored tank could hope to survive long enough to use it. The answer came from an unlikely partnership between the Petroleum Warfare Department, the engineering firm AEC, and the driving persistence of Major General Percy Hobart, the officer charged with developing specialized armor for the invasion of Europe. After watching a demonstration of the improved flame equipment in 1943, Hobart pushed hard for it to be adopted, and the Ministry of Supplies settled on the Churchill Mark VII infantry tank as its platform. The choice made sense on paper and in the field. The Churchill was slow, rarely capable of much more than 15 miles an hour, but it was the most heavily armored tank in British service, with frontal protection up to 152 millimeters thick, roughly 6 inches of hardened steel, enough to absorb punishment that would have destroyed lighter vehicles outright. Designed from the outset to crawl forward alongside infantry rather than race across open country, it was, in effect, already built for exactly the kind of grinding, close-quarters fighting that flame warfare demanded. Engineers replaced the tank's hull-mounted machine gun with a flame projector, while the turret kept its standard 75mm gun, meaning the Crocodile, as the conversion came to be known, lost none of its ability to fight as an ordinary battle tank. The fuel itself, a thickened mixture given the wartime designation Fuel K, behaved rather like a modern petrol jelly, clinging to whatever it struck and burning even on wet surfaces, a crucial property in a French summer of frequent rain. This fuel was carried not inside the tank, but in a separate armored trailer weighing 6.5 tons, connected to the hull by a 3-jointed articulated coupling that crews nicknamed the Link, which allowed the trailer to pitch, roll, and swivel independently as it followed the tank across broken ground. The trailer held some 400 gallons of fuel, around 1,800 liters, together with 5 cylinders of compressed nitrogen that provided the pressure to fire it. Enough in total for roughly 81-second bursts of flame. Fully charged, the system could throw a jet of burning fuel to a range of around 100 meters, with some trials recording distances closer to 140 meters, depending on wind conditions, at a discharge rate of around 4 imperial gallons, some 18 liters, every single second. Crucially, if the tank came under fire that threatened to ignite the trailer, the crew could jettison it entirely from within the vehicle, a safety measure that let the Churchill continue fighting as a conventional gun tank even after its flame fuel was gone or too dangerous to keep attached. The conversion itself was designed to be fitted by REME workshops in the field, using a kit rather than requiring an entirely new factory production line, and around 800 such kits were eventually manufactured, sufficient to equip 3 regiments of Crocodiles along with training vehicles and battlefield replacements, with a reserve held back in case flame tanks were needed against Japan in the Pacific. Put into the hands of the 51st, later the 31st Tank Brigade, part of Hobart's celebrated 79th Armoured Division, and its unusual collection of specialized vehicles that troops nicknamed Hobart's Funnies, the Crocodile went ashore in Normandy in the weeks following the 6th of June 1944 and was soon in action across the bridgehead. Historians continue to debate exactly how many individual actions the Crocodile fought in that summer, since so much of its work took place in small, localized engagements against isolated strongpoints rather than headline battles. But its presence is recorded again and again in the fighting around Caen, in the bitter contest for fortified villages such as Colombelles, and in the slow, costly advance through the bocage country beyond. Time after time, the pattern repeated itself. Infantry pinned down by a machine gun nest or a concrete bunker would call forward a Crocodile, The tank would close to within 100 meters or so under covering fire, and a single burst of flame would either destroy the position outright or, just as often, prompt an immediate surrender from defenders who had held firm under artillery and air attack alike. If you're enjoying this journey through history, subscribing genuinely helps us continue bringing remarkable true stories like this to the channel. The psychological weight of the weapon mattered as much as its physical destructiveness, and there is no surviving evidence confirming precise figures for how many German soldiers surrendered specifically at the sight of a crocodile rather than being burned by one, though wartime accounts from both British and German veterans describe the flame tank as uniquely terrifying among the weapons of that campaign, and captured German troops reportedly treated crocodile crews with particular hostility when taken prisoner, aware of what the weapon had done to their comrades. Crews themselves lived with a peculiar strain unknown to most other tank soldiers, aware that a lucky hit on the trailer behind them could turn their own vehicle into a source of instant, uncontrollable fire, and that capture might mean treatment far harsher than that afforded to ordinary prisoners of war. Refueling and repressurizing a crocodile in the field was itself a slow, exposed business, reportedly taking upwards of 90 minutes for fuel and a further quarter of an hour to build pressure in the nitrogen system, time during which the vehicle and its crew were especially vulnerable, and so crocodiles were typically husbanded for specific set-piece assaults on known strongpoints rather than committed casually to every skirmish. Accounts from the fighting around Caen describe infantry officers requesting crocodile support by name once word of the weapon's effect had spread through the ranks, a reputation that, according to wartime reports, sometimes proved almost as valuable as the flame itself, since German defenders who had heard what the tank could do occasionally abandoned positions the moment its distinctive trailer was sighted approaching along a lane or across a field, sparing both sides further bloodshed that a purely conventional assault would not have avoided. Britain was far from alone in reaching for fire as a battlefield weapon. The United States fielded its own flame tanks based on the Sherman, popularly nicknamed Ronson or Zippo tanks, after the cigarette lighters of the day, mounting flame projectors either in place of the hull gun or, in Pacific service, disguised within a dummy main gun barrel to preserve the vehicle's silhouette. These American conversions generally carried less fuel than the Crocodile's dedicated trailer system and so offered shorter overall firing time, though they avoided the vulnerability of towing an external trailer across the battlefield. Germany, too, had experimented with the Flampanzer, flame-throwing versions of the Panzer II and later the Panzer III. But by the time of the Normandy campaign, these had become rare, hampered by fuel shortages and the demands of the Eastern Front on German industry. The Soviet Union deployed its own flame tanks, notably variants of the T-34 known as the OT-34, which, like the American designs, carried their fuel internally rather than in a separate trailer, trading protection for simplicity. Where the Crocodile stood apart was in the sheer volume of fuel it could bring to bear, and the survivability of its jettisonable trailer system, a solution that let British designers avoid the single greatest weakness of internally fueled flame tanks, the risk of a catastrophic explosion if the fuel tank itself were struck. Its heavy Churchill armor, moreover, gave it a level of protection that lighter Sherman and T-34-based flame tanks simply could not match, allowing Crocodile crews to close to effective range with far greater confidence of surviving the approach. Exact numbers remain uncertain when comparing overall combat effectiveness between these designs, since flame tanks across every army tended to be used in specialized, small-scale actions rather than large formations, making direct statistical comparison difficult, but among Allied and German commanders who left recorded assessments, the Crocodile was widely regarded as among the most effective flame weapons of the entire war. Japanese forces facing American flame tanks across the Pacific fielded comparatively few armored flame vehicles of their own, relying instead on fixed emplacements and man-carried weapons, a doctrinal choice that left them with little answer to the American Ronson tanks, clearing bunker systems on islands such as Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Italian development of flame armor, meanwhile, remained limited throughout the war and never reached the scale seen in British, American, German, or Soviet service. What united every one of these national efforts was a shared recognition that fortified positions manned by determined defenders could absorb enormous quantities of conventional firepower and remain functional, and that flame, for all its horror, offered a psychological and physical solution that high explosive alone often could not. Where armies differed was in how they balanced protection against simplicity. The Crocodile's external trailer demanded more maintenance and more careful tactical handling than an internally fueled Sherman or T-34, but in exchange it offered a reserve of fuel and therefore sustained firing time that none of its rivals could equal, along with a crew that could discard the danger entirely at the flick of a lever if the battle turned against them. For more incredible true stories from World War II, carefully researched and brought to life, subscribe to the channel and never miss a new documentary. The immediate battlefield impact of the Crocodile was measured in strong points reduced and casualties among attacking infantry that were, in many recorded actions, dramatically lower than in comparable assaults without flame support. Its longer-term influence reached further still. The lessons learned from combining heavy armor, a jettisonable and independently pressurized fuel supply, and close cooperation with infantry shaped how the British Army thought about specialized armored vehicles for decades afterwards, feeding directly into post-war doctrine on combat engineering vehicles and the wider concept, pioneered by Hobart's division, that different battlefield problems demanded purpose-built armored solutions rather than a single universal tank. Crocodiles remained in British service into the early 1950s and saw further action during the Korean War, a conflict fought in terrain and against fortifications not unlike those the tank had first been designed to overcome. Today, surviving examples can be found in museums that preserve this unusual chapter of engineering history, including a preserved crocodile displayed outside the Memorial Museum of the Battle of Normandy in Bayeux, not far from the fields where it once fought, as well as examples held by the Tank Museum at Bovington and the Cobboton Combat Collection in Devon, their trailers silent now, their projectors cold, yet still unmistakably built for a singular and terrible purpose. Return, for a moment, to that wet July morning near Maltot, to the column of tanks creeping forward through drizzle and mud, to the strange, obedient trailer following behind steel tracks. What that single moment represented was not simply a new weapon, but an entire philosophy of war. One built on the hard-won understanding that raw firepower alone could not break the fortifications Germany had spent years perfecting, and that sometimes the only way to save infantry lives was to design a machine capable of doing something almost unthinkable. The Churchill Crocodile was never intended to be an instrument of terror for its own sake. It was, in the cold language of its original specification, an engineering solution to a specific tactical problem. The reduction of fortified positions that conventional weapons could not efficiently defeat, and it was built by men who understood that every minute spent besieging a single bunker was a minute in which soldiers on both sides continued to die. That it also became one of the most psychologically devastating weapons of the entire war was, in many ways, an unavoidable consequence of what fire does to the human mind, rather than a goal deliberately sought by its designers. Historians continue to debate the ethics of flame warfare, then as now, and this documentary does not set out to settle that argument, only to record what was built, why it was built, and what it achieved on the battlefields of Normandy in the summer of 1944. What can be said with confidence is this: a slow, heavily armored infantry tank, judged too cumbersome for the fast-moving campaigns some had imagined for the invasion of Europe, became instead one of the decisive tools for breaking open the very defenses that campaign depended on overcoming. Behind its riveted trailer and its 400 gallons of thickened fuel stood the work of engineers at the Petroleum Warfare Department. The persistence of a general who refused to let a good idea die after an early rejection, and the extraordinary courage of the small crews who drove these machines to within 100 meters of an enemy, determined to kill them before they could act. Few weapons of the Second World War carried such a stark, almost primal contrast between their purpose and their method. An infantry tank that existed to save lives by wielding one of the oldest and most feared forces known to humanity. The Churchill Crocodile did not win the war alone, and no honest history would claim that it did. But in the bocage country of Normandy, in the ruins of villages whose names rarely made the headlines back home, it bought ground, saved infantry, and broke the will of defenders in a way few other weapons of its era could match. A fire-breathing answer to a wall of concrete and steel, built by ordinary people determined to end an extraordinary war.